hunt for Gaddafi's billions premieres.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, he said more heat on the government after revelations that an internal inquiry into its handling of a rape complaint was paused. Disaster zones declared across New South Wales as flooding rains forced thousands to evacuate. Still, it keeps falling. And can the romance between big business and the unions be rekindled, or has the government blown a once-in-a-generation shot at industrial relations reform? Joining me on the panel tonight, Education Officer at the Australian National University Student Association, Madeleine Chia. Lovely to see you. First show.
Thank you so much for having me.
In Canberra today, CEO of the Council of Small Business Australia, Peter Strong. Good to see you, Peter.
Thank you, Ellen.
In Melbourne tonight, Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Sally McManus. Good evening.
Good evening.
And Senior Fellow at the University of Melbourne School of Government and former Liberal, Victorian Liberal MP, John Pesutto. Always lovely to see you, John.
G'day, Ellen.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. Now, the inquiry into who in the Prime Minister's office knew about an alleged rape in Parliament House has been put on hold. The Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Philip Gaetjens, told a Senate estimates hearing that he had been advised by the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, Rhys Kershaw, that his inquiry could hamper their own investigation.
I was strongly advised, I think would probably be the expression, to make sure that there was no intersection with the criminal investigation. And as a result, I have decided to pause the inquiry.
In his own evidence, Rhys Kershaw said that he had raised some concerns, but decisions about how the Gaetjens inquiry proceeded was a matter for the government. Now, Mr Gaetjens also revealed that he had made no effort to speak with the Liberal staffer who made the allegation, Brittany Higgins, prompting outrage from Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. Have a listen.
This is for the benefit of Ms Higgins, Senator. This is
They're
not
off.
for me.
Come on.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Well, she doesn't feel that way.
She doesn't feel it at all. Senator Hanson-Young. Senator Gallagher has the call.
That is not her view, that everyone sitting on that side of the table is here for her interests.
Yeah, don't.
Please don't use her.
Do not use her
interests as a shield.
Madeleine, I'll start with you. You spoke at the Women's March in Canberra last week. Do you understand the distress and the reaction of those women today?
Absolutely. It's quite challenging to see that the inquiry was not, given public opinion or any kind of public warning that it was going to close. So it's quite distressing to see that.
And what about his decision not to talk to Brittany Higgins for concerns about her own privacy, to respect her privacy? I mean, as a survivor yourself, what's your view of that decision that he made, not to speak to her?
I think that decision is really disgusting on behalf of all survivors. These types of decisions and inquiries should be survivor-based and survivor-led, and unfortunately it feels like the power has been actually taken out of Brittany Higgins' hands in this instance. And she's been quite public about being a survivor and about her experiences, as we saw at the Women's March for Justice in Canberra, where she discussed her story. And yeah, it's quite disappointing to see the reactions currently.
And so let's think about his view that here's the woman at the centre of the allegations, the centre of the whole affair, and she's not being spoken to. What do you think Philip Gaetjens has misunderstood about what he should be trying to do?
I think he's misunderstood the trauma that comes with being a survivor and the trauma that comes with sexual assault and sexual violence, especially in such a high-powered institution like Parliament. And I guess from a young person's perspective, it's really concerning that this is the attitude that's been taken by members of the Parliament. And it really puts into question the future of young people, especially going into Parliament, whether this, will be an issue later on, and it's quite scary to think about.
Sally, today a critical issue came up about this senior bureaucrat, Philip Gaetjens, who was asked to get to the bottom of who knew what in Scott Morrison's office about the allegations. And the PM let Parliament believe last week that the inquiry was ongoing. That was the sort of verbs he was using was present tense verbs, that the inquiry was ongoing, even though 8 days beforehand apparently he'd been advised by Gaetjens that the whole thing was on hold. How serious a matter is that for the Prime Minister and the government?
Well, I think that the government uses inquiries as a device. It's sort of, if there's an emergency and you want to break glass, say, we'll send it off to an inquiry, and then they seem to hope that it will die and that people will forget about it and the circus will move on and people won't ask questions. And what they don't understand in this circumstance is two things. What Madeleine said, first of all, the most important person in all of this is Brittany Higgins, and making sure that she understands what people knew about what allegedly happened to her. But secondly, women of Australia aren't letting this go. We want to know what happened as well. And I really wonder whether it's moved from this issue of maybe not caring and not understanding the survivor in this circumstance to actually maybe now a cover-up, like not wanting to ever reveal who knew what. All those questions raised about whether the Prime Minister's office was backgrounding Brittany's partner, allegations about him. All of these things are unanswered. And I think that this sort of, using inquiries to try and manage something politically and hope something goes away is a pretty disgusting way to go about this particular issue.
Peter Strong, does it matter if the Prime Minister was in fact told on March 9 that the inquiry had been paused, and then on March 18 he kind of used language to suggest, when people were asking, hey, what's happening with this inquiry, that he gave the impression that it was ongoing? Does that matter?
Well, it does. You should, if you know something, you say this is what's happening, so it does matter. And we've seen it happen in the past before, and we'll see it happen again. People need to say what's happening, and if, as you say, 8 days or 9 days before he was told that it wasn't, then he should not have given that impression. And in the run of all these sorts of things, just listening to Madeleine and Sally, is I always think, what would Brittany say? That's watching all this unfold. It's obviously a very strong woman. And women are the people that should be consulted around all these issues and what should be happening. But certainly, I think the Prime Minister probably should have said he knew it had been stopped.
What's your view on it, John?
Yeah, look, I think there are going to need to be some better explanations, to be quite frank. I think in terms of Mr Gaetjens' review, I don't doubt that Rhys Kershaw gave him that advice. It seems to be the common position that each of them have. So there may well be reasonable bases for that. It's not uncommon that, if you like, a civil investigation is paused while there's a criminal investigation.
Yeah, go on, Sally.
So I was just going to say that part's not as controversial to me as whether there was a good basis for not interviewing Ms Higgins.
Yeah.
I'd need to know more about that, but it would strike me as a curious matter, because I think if you look at the scope of the Gaetjens review, it is to look at who knew what and when, and I would have thought any discussions that may have taken place, and I'm not professing to know, but any discussions between Ms Higgins and anyone in the PMO or anyone else connected with that would be a part of that investigation. But in fairness, I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, Sally, Sally, can I go to you? Is it really all that clear? Because, obviously Senate estimates are on, these public servants are being grilled. We have Philip Gaetjens saying, well, look, the AFP told me to suspend the inquiry. And at the other end of the hall, the AFP says, oh, no, we didn't tell him that. And then later they put out a statement saying, oh, well, OK, well, we strongly advised him to hold off on interviews. That's a pretty interesting state of affairs, isn't it? That the head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet's office says, I was told by the AFP to stop, and the AFP says, well, not exactly.
Well, in Peter Dutton's words, he said, she said, what I think about this is, if it were my workplace, if I was the most powerful person in a workplace, or if I was the employer, would you want to know if a rape had happened in your workplace? If it were me, I would pull the place apart to find out what happened and who knew what, especially if I found out that my own staff didn't tell me. So that's a bit I don't get. Like, you can say it should have been this person doing an inquiry or this person. If you're the person in charge, why aren't you furious that no one told you that this alleged rape happened? Why aren't you so angry about that you go about and find out the truth for yourself?
Madeleine, it's interesting because did you get the feeling today that politics is overtaking that central issue that Sally's talking about?
I definitely agree with Sally. I think that there is definitely a lack of transparency within the government about this issue, and it's an issue that unfortunately affects 1 in 5 women and non-binary people. So it's extremely concerning to hear, the whole he said, she said thing, because, we need to stand up and say enough is enough, and we need to do better, especially in Parliament, which is, our leading governing body.
What's the issue, John? I mean, you're seeing the issue with not speaking to Brittany Higgins, and that's a fairly glaring issue as far as the women on that Senate estimates hearing we saw today, the senators there. Why are we still talking about this day after day after day when there are all these inquiries? Why can't the government come up with a process for handling this that means that it is seen to be investigated in a proper manner?
Well, I think the thing I'd say about that is it might have been better for an announcement of some sort to be made if, according to Mr Gaetjens, the advice from the AFP was to pause the investigation. So I don't think there's any tenable way the investigation by Mr Gaetjens can be stopped. I think it can only be paused because I think people will want to see that through. There is a mood for this to see all of these investigations and inquiries now through, and I think it's an example of when there may be a basis for advice from law enforcement agencies to cease or pause another investigation. But I think what's happened here is the absence of an announcement of some sort to make it clear that it's being paused on this basis at the time that advice is received. I think it won't then generate the kinds of discussions which in my view should be unnecessary, because I think most reasonable people would think, well, if the police have given that advice, that's fine, but to learn about it today, maybe not so much.
Peter Strong, do you think it would be appropriate for Philip Gaetjens to release this report publicly into who knew what in the Prime Minister's office about an alleged rape that occurred just metres from that room?
If there's a report, it should be released. But if I was Philip Gaetjens, I'd be having solicitors and lawyers and the police look at the report to make sure that it's something that can be released. I'm no lawyer, and I know lawyers make things very muddy, but that's where I'd be going with any report, to make sure that innocent people aren't accused of things they haven't done, and that other people don't end up on social media where they shouldn't belong. But in the end, as I say, that what we should be talking about is what happened and what we can do about to make sure it doesn't happen in the future, and what we do for people like Brittany is the real issue. And I think that gets lost quite often in the process of politics. Well, not surprising.
Yeah. Tonight on Four Corners, they'll bring you the story of a security guard working at Parliament House who says she was on duty the night that Brittany Higgins alleges she was raped. That will certainly be worth watching, 8:30 tonight on the ABC. Elsewhere today, Scott Morrison has said the government won't oppose a vote to establish a Royal Commission into veteran suicides. The government has previously resisted calls for such an inquiry, instead arguing for the appointment of a permanent national commissioner. A motion was set to come before the House of Representatives today, calling on the government to establish a Royal Commission. Tasmanian Senator Jackie Lambie insists it is the only way forward.
Just give them a Royal Commission. That's what they've asked for. That's what they've pleaded for. The Commission has been, it's been a half-cut bloody steak sandwich from the beginning. Get rid of it. People will respect you more, Prime Minister, if you just pull the plug on it and give the veterans what they need, and they need a Royal Commission.
John, a half-cut steak sandwich is the Commissioner proposal, and a Royal Commission is the only way. What's your view?
Look, the first thing I'd say is clearly suicide among veterans is unacceptable, and mental health issues have long been unaddressed. So I think we're all on a unity ticket on wanting to address the issue. For my part, whilst I think that a Royal Commission will happen, I think the cards seem to be falling that way. I have been concerned at a federal and state level for some time that governments continue to outsource the function. Now, I understand the passion for a Royal Commission, not only on this, but on a range of issues. The question I'm increasingly asking myself is, why isn't government, in its ongoing operations, addressing these critical issues? Is it because departments and agencies are lacking the capability to be looking at the sort of crises that, in this case, affect veterans and their families and not being able to deal with it? Why isn't government better able to manage these crises as we go along? And what we're doing, for reasons I can understand at a political level, a government can say, here's a Royal Commission, an independent person with a wide range of coercive powers. But increasingly I'm asking that question. So it will happen, as it appears to be the case, but I think there are now bigger questions about why government's not doing that. And if you look at the Aged Care Royal Commission recently, a very important body of work, but we ended up with dissentient reports.
Right.
And if that's going to happen, that's what Parliament does.
Yeah. And we're going to spend a lot more time on this topic this week. You just go back to March 2016, a Senate inquiry, 2016, right? 5 years ago. Nearly 1 in 4 returned soldiers had experienced a mental disorder in the previous 12 months, and the rate of suicide was double that of the general population. So we're going to spend a lot more time thinking about this issue later in the week. And if this topic has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline 131114 or Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636. New South Wales is in the midst of the worst flooding event in living memory. The Premier says 38 areas have been declared natural disaster zones and the situation is still evolving.
I just want to say to everybody across the state who is currently living in fear and anxiety that all of us are thinking of you. Some communities who were battered by the bushfires are now being battered by the floods, and deep drought prior to that. And I don't know any time in our state's history when we've had these extreme weather conditions in such quick succession in the middle of a pandemic.
For those that have lost homes or businesses, one-off disaster payments have already been announced, but longer-term support will be necessary, and for many, there will be questions over how those recovery funds are allocated, especially in light of the way bushfire relief funds have been distributed. We now know that the New South Wales government sought to spend almost $200 million of bushfire funding without any open application process, and that Liberal-held seats were prioritised. Just $2.5 million of the $177 million spent so far has gone to Labor-held seats. There were even questions from the federal government over how the co-funded grants were being allocated.
It is expected that any Commonwealth funding given to states and territories to assist those recovering from disaster is provided to those in need quickly and efficiently.
Sally, let's talk about these floods. We're hearing, this was a once-in-a-100-year event, that this was not expected. And I read today that Robert Glasser, Australian Centre for Climate Security at the Australian Strategic Policy Initiative, who can tell you anything you want to know about relations with China, right? National security and climate change is part of that, says, well, saying it's rare and unexpected is politically useful, but with climate change, that's not accurate anymore.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, scientists have been warning us of exactly this for decades, that with the planet heating, there's going to be more extreme weather events, and bushfires and floods are extreme weather events. So I think this is about us doing two things. Number one, what are we doing as a country and as a globe, but what we can control here in Australia to limit the global warming. But secondly, not pretending that this is some outlier. This is our life now. This is our life with already, 1.1 degree we've heated in Australia, and it's going to go up further. That, we all know that we never used to see days that were over 45 degrees, and now we do. Well, if this is the case, what are we doing to respond to that? Because things like these, terrible floods in New South Wales and terrible bushfires, unfortunately, we're going to see more of them.
Peter Strong, people really have been taken by surprise in New South Wales. You listen to the news and people have left things behind and then had the whole building go under. They've left things on the top floor. They've left things behind in their businesses because there was really no understanding that how much water is coming, how much is coming out of Warragamba Dam. What are you hearing from the small business community?
Oh, they're devastated. We're not hearing a lot at the moment because they're in the middle of it all. It's a bit like the bushfires.
Yeah.
But we know with the bushfires that they were devastated. They were so upset for their workers, the ones who employed people. The industry associations were really concerned emotionally for their members. And then through COVID, we saw it with JobKeeper and other measures that it was about the workers, it was about these individuals, and now they're going through it again. Well, then they went through lockdowns, which was again very stressful on everybody, and now we're seeing it with the floods. And as Sally said, as the scientists say, as many people say, this is not going to stop. This is in front of us. We've learned so many lessons over the last 12 months, so many lessons. We've got to put together now plans of action that we can put into place straight away. We know exactly what's going to come. We know there's going to be more fires and floods and droughts, and there's going to be another pandemic, hopefully a long time away. But we know what works, we know what doesn't work. We've done a fabulous job with the pandemic. Let's have the plans there now in place, ready to action within a day. That's what we've learned, the lessons. Let's apply them.
Yeah. Can we turn to the matter, John, of how the money gets distributed, right? And we were referencing earlier what had happened with those bushfire grants, and we know that pork barrelling, which is assigning government funds to local areas with the aim of winning votes, is a common occurrence in New South Wales politics, and we know that because the Premier told us herself last year.
The term pork barrelling is common parlance in where you provide funding, and it's not something that I know the community is comfortable with. But if the accusation is that the government favoured certain areas, well, that's an accusation we'll wear. It's not, unfortunately, unique or uncommon to my government.
It's not illegal, was the other thing Gladys Berejiklian said, John. You know, and now we find $107 million was handed to 22 projects in New South Wales that the government identified and then invited them to apply for the funds. Only $2.5 million went to Labor-held areas. None of that money went to the Blue Mountains. And 7:30 tonight says that, in fact, the New South Wales government wanted to spend twice that amount, $200 million on hand-picked projects, without any open application process.
Yeah, I'm not sure that statement of the Premier would stand up in the dispensation of emergency relief. I think Australians everywhere would want to know that a government's motivated by only one thing, administering urgent aid to people and communities who really need it.
Well, this was recovery aid, right? So this wasn't straight after the fires had gone through. This was later with the rebuilding, and this is the reality. And we know all this, not because it's brought out by a regulator, but because of persistent and forensic questioning by one person, which is the Greens MP David Shoebridge in New South Wales. That's the only reason we know this.
Yeah, I understand the New South Wales government is also saying, though, that a lot of that money, perhaps not all of it, I don't know where every dollar went, but that it did favour coalition seats because most of them are in those areas. But that's not to say there aren't issues. And I think right across the board, federal, state, you know, right across the country, recent issues, whether it's this, grants in and around the country, there needs to be greater transparency, in my view, about this. And governments do it all the time. In my state of Victoria, there have long been issues about where funding is going under different governments. And my view's long been that there needs to be better transparency about that. It is the case that parties can go to elections with commitments about money, but that's not what we're talking about in these types of issues. In these types of cases, we're talking about funds that, in my view, ought to be dispensed according to need and urgency.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, John, but Sally, the Blue Mountains got zip. I mean, the Blue Mountains burnt to the point that now these floodwaters are this weird, ashy sludge, because that's what's coming down the mountain, right? And they got nothing out of this first round.
We should not accept this as normal. We shouldn't accept it as this is just the way it goes. When one, party gets in government, they do it. When the other, they do it. As a country, we should just be saying no. And the reason is it's our money, first of all, taxpayers' money, all of our money. But more importantly, every single person affected by that, they don't have stamped on their head, the electorate they live in. We're all Australians. If we're in need, it should go according to need. And I agree with what was said about it being transparent. I think that that's critically important. But even more important, as you can hear from what Gladys said, is depoliticising it, taking the politics out of it, so we can make sure that the one decision is made is that the people who most need it get it, not according to what electorate they happen to be in.
Yeah. What do you think, Madeleine? You work at the ANU. You help fellow students navigate the world of work and get their rights and all the rest of it. These are key moments in the life of a nation, aren't they, when we say, here's the money to help you recover from the bushfire, and we discover whether we can trust institutions, whether we can have faith in our politicians. What impact has it had on you?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting to see what has been going on at the moment, and I think it really shows the essence of politics, to be honest. I think that there is definitely, like Sally said, there's a lack of transparency within, what is going on, and young people have lost faith in the institution of Parliament and what it's meant to represent. And I think it really shows that we need to be able to trust the government to do something for the benefit of all of Australians, rather than for the benefit of whether they'll win the next federal election. So,
well, this is state, but yeah,
state election, yeah.
Yeah, and you took the time to talk to friends today before coming on the show about this unbelievable flood after those unbelievable fires last year, and you didn't have to ring round much to find friends who knew at a scientific level about climate change. And how much fear and concern is there in your age group when you see these sorts of crazy weather events?
I mean, we're already seeing, so many young people and young children standing up against the government and fighting for climate change and making sure that, we don't have to live through this, because ultimately the government can say and do many things while they're in Parliament. However, it's their children, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren that will be affected. We are the ones who are going to have to suffer. And I think, we've already seen, it's already become 1 degree warmer since the Industrial Revolution, and that has meant there's 7% extra water vapour in the atmosphere. And I do concede, Australia is a country of many extremes. We have extreme droughts and we have extreme floods. However, they will become more extreme if the government doesn't do something, and that will ultimately affect young people and people like myself going into the future.
Well, the deluge along the New South Wales east coast is set to continue, with 3 weather systems set to collide over the coming days, bringing yet more torrential rain. Today, Sydney's Warragamba Dam will spill enough water to fill the city's harbour, and it spilled around double that over the weekend. Wrap your head around that. Deb and Andy Saunders have a homewares shop in the mid-north coast town of Taree, which was inundated by floodwaters over the weekend.
Yeah, our weekend started with a call from our landlord, our real estate agent at our store in Taree. And we are a few minutes walk from the Manning River, so we were going under. Recently we lost our mum, and we had some of her personal items stored in our shop. We had photographs and things like that, and we were all really worried about that. But my sister that lives near the store has been in, and those things survived. And within hours, the water was waist deep in our store. We can't get into the store because our 2 bridges, the main bridges that feed into Taree, the Martin Bridge and Dawson Bridge, are both damaged, and they're both closed until further notice, because there was so much debris washing down the river. The engineers need to go in to see if the bridges are safe for anyone.
One of the actual piers in the bridge have been damaged quite considerably. So it's too dangerous to drive across.
You may have seen pictures of legends going out, on their boats to try and save cows being washed away. Our neighbour has gone to the beach a couple of times to save cows, 2 cows that have washed from the river, maybe up to 30 kilometres away from the beach, and they've survived and washed up on the beach, and one of them was buried in sand up to its tummy, and it's been really rough. We've had droughts, fires, pandemic, and now catastrophic floods within, I think, the last
2 years.
2 years.
if we get locusts next or something like that?
It's enough. We don't need any more.
It's plenty. We've had enough.
Extraordinary pictures, that house floating down the river, just extraordinary. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel are Education Officer at the Australian National University Students Association, Madeleine Chia. In Canberra, CEO of the Council of Small Business Australia, Peter Strong. In Melbourne, the Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Sally McManus, and Senior Fellow at the University of Melbourne's School of Government, John Pesutto. We've heard it 1,000 times over the last year. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. Australia has come through the pandemic in a better position than almost any country in the world. If there was ever a moment for wholesale reform, this was it. So with that in mind, almost a year ago, the government convened roundtables with the unions, industry representatives and businesses with the aim of sorting out the vexed issue of industrial relations. On the table was enterprise bargaining, award simplification and casual work, all to be wrapped up in one big omnibus bill. But by the time it passed through the Senate on Thursday, the bill was a shadow of its former self, an omnibust. So what went wrong? The Drum's Eliza Harvey explains.
In 2018, former union boss turned opposition leader Bill Shorten said workplace laws were in dire need of reform.
Enterprise bargaining itself is on life support. It should be a driver of both wages growth and productivity. But the number of enterprise agreements ratified by the Fair Work Commission last year was the lowest number since 1995, when the enterprise bargaining system was in its infancy.
Enterprise bargaining refers to the system where employers and their staff strike agreements, rather than operating under a centralised wage system. With wages stagnant for years now, encouraging more enterprise bargaining to drive productivity and wages growth became one of the key planks of the government's reform agenda. When the COVID pandemic hit, the Industrial Relations Minister brought the key groups together in an effort to reach rare consensus.
I think I would summarise today as a very optimistic start to the process.
It's absolutely vital that we work together, and the business community stands ready to work side by side with the union movement, with government.
Going forward, we are going to give this process a go. We're going to approach it with an open mind. We're going to approach it in good faith.
The roundtable discussions developed an outline for the reform bill. And then the government included a provision that hadn't been discussed. To give some breathing room to COVID-affected businesses, they removed a clause that guaranteed no worker would be worse off under any enterprise deal. The union saw it as an ambush, and the compromise was shattered.
Does the Prime Minister now admit that his industrial relations changes failed to meet?
A heavily watered-down bill was passed through Parliament last week.
I think it was potentially in a lifetime opportunity to get that industrial relations reform to focus on actual growth. And that didn't get achieved. So really disappointed that that's where we landed on that particular issue. And of course, there's more to be done.
We started with high hopes of getting some deal done between union, government and business. But in the end, quite frankly, unions just walked away and didn't want to have anything to do with it, even with things that they'd supported, proposed and endorsed.
The bill did deal with one pressing issue, protecting businesses from having to pay back billions in back pay to casual workers. It comes in response to the case of Paul Skeen, a fly-in, fly-out miner who was found by the federal court to be eligible for the pay and conditions of a permanent employee, even though he was employed as a casual. And as for the modest, long overdue reforms, they've been abandoned. And just as Australia needed every tool possible to help businesses and workers recover from the COVID recession.
Sally McManus, let's do this chronologically. Take me back a year when the Christian Porter, the Industrial Relations Minister, was saying, if you'd told me I was going to be BFF, best friends forever, with Sally McManus 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have believed you. Take me back to that moment where in the midst of a crisis you came together.
Well, employers and the government and unions, workers found ourselves all in the same boat. Like, we were facing a pandemic. None of us had ever faced a pandemic before, and overnight we were seeing, the economy shut down and workers lose their jobs all over the place. And so that was an incredibly traumatic experience for a lot of workers. And in this case, businesses were we're all in the same boat. We were all faced with the same problem. It wasn't businesses' fault that economies were being shut down because of pandemic either. And so that meant that we were in crisis management for months, really. And during that crisis management, the union movement advocated for a wage subsidy, which ended up being JobKeeper. We're very proud that we achieved that, and that's something the government, adopted. That saved literally 3.3 million jobs, so that was very good. And out of that, I guess the government then set up these roundtables. They invited us to be part of them. We agreed, and as you heard me say, we would go into it with good faith, which we did. We had just one bottom line, and that's workers not going backwards. And I can go on because the key seeds of that omnibus bill failing actually were last year too. We worked really hard to come to an agreement with the Business Council of Australia, which is effectively big business, on how enterprise bargaining could work. We listened really carefully to what their concerns were. They listened to what ours were too, which was protecting workers. We came up with an agreement, a deal, if you want to call it that, of a way forward that involved, a new way forward. Unfortunately, what happened is that the other employer groups walked away and said they wouldn't accept it. And the reason why they did that is because they wanted changes that were all going to be their way, take rights off workers. And unfortunately, that's then pretty much what came forward in the bill. And so it was always going to be doomed for any government that brings up a proposal that's going to take workers backwards, going to cut their pay or take away their rights, especially at a time when we've got record low wage growth.
Peter Strong, your organisation, everybody was charged with this optimism last year, weren't they? Sally was sitting down with Christian Porter 3 times a week. They were having meetings. You've got Sally and Michelle O'Neill on speed dial. There were these 5 working groups to fix up this rickety industrial relations system that we just saw. And your organisation sat on 3 of the working groups: casuals, award simplification and wage theft, right? Now, the Australians, you and Hannon, reported on the weekend that the government figures said, quote, employer representatives were regularly more difficult to deal with than union officials. Do you agree?
I agree. I totally agree. The lack of trust between the unions and those employer groups was profound, and I found myself getting more frustrated with the so-called employer groups than I was with the unions.
Presumably you're not referring to your own employer group.
Well, no, we don't see ourselves, we've never normally been involved in this, and this is why it was good to be in those 3 groups. We don't normally get involved, we're not part of the IR Club, and so when I talk about the Employer IR Club, we're talking about the Australian Chamber, the Australian Industry Group, Master Builders, those sorts of organisations who live and breathe workplace relations. They have lawyers employed, they love it, they love the complexity, they make money from it. In our world, in my world, it's about reality of standing next to someone you employ. And we heard in those groups that the unions got that a lot more. We ended up coming very close to agreeing on a casual definition, so we ended up being a 3rd group in those negotiations.
So is Sally part of the IR Club and part of the problem, in your opinion, or not?
Oh, not in this case, no. The unions normally, we've accused the unions of being part of the problem because we say they like complexity as well. But I've got to say, what we're seeing over the last few weeks has not been pursuit of complexity. It's been the opposite, with two things going on. One is our support of each other in the omnibus bill, and the other one is another submission gone in separately to the Fair Work Commission, which is about removing complexity. So I can't complain about that, and I won't complain about it.
Can I bounce into the real world, Madeleine, with, not that you don't exist in the real world, Peter and Sally and John, but you talk to your friends about their experiences in workplaces today, and they started telling you some horror stories. Tell me about the coach who worked for a high school. What did that person go through?
Yeah, so I have an unidentified friend who is a coach at a high school, and she has not been paid for about 15 hours of labour. Her boss said that she would only be paid for 5 hours because she, quote unquote, was not working properly. Keep in mind, this is a sporting team, and she was also doing the work of an admin assistant as well because the previous admin assistant had been fired. And her boss said that she was not working because she was standing around, which when you're watching a team, you as a coach, you watch them and work on, what you can do to better prepare them next time. And so her boss has withheld pay, and this is not the first time she's withheld pay.
And what's your experience of young people? Because you've got all sorts of other experiences. You spoke to a girl today, worked at a fast food place and wasn't given super. And lots of examples of unpaid trials. That seems to be a thing with young people.
Absolutely. I think the reason why young people are so exploited, especially when they go into casual or insecure work, is because of our age. We're so young and we're so vulnerable, and this is often, our first or second job. And a lot of these people go into especially like cafes and things like that, and they're not given the proper award wage, they're not given super like you said before, and they're not given adequate pay for training.
And they don't want to go to the Fair Work Commission, they don't want to lodge a complaint, because that's what you'd say to them from the association?
Well, I think coming from a young person's perspective myself, as someone who has not been paid for working before, I think it's a really scary thing to do. As for me, I've only just turned 20, and if I had to go through that process, I would be quite scared. And I know a lot of people are quite afraid to do that, especially because of the power dynamics between, bosses and casual workers, with bosses being quite a bit older than these young workers. And there's always the threat of, oh, you will get fired if you go and say these things to the Fair Workers Commission, for example.
And John Pesutto, there's not only those sorts of issues that are, everybody agrees. We saw Bill Shorten, the union movement knows that we've got a really rickety industrial relations system in this country. The bosses, the employer groups, COSBO, they all know we've got an issue. And we know that enterprise bargaining, which was, it came into being when Paul Keating and Bob Hawke deregulated the labour market. It's a way to get flexible agreements, it's a way to drive productivity in workforces, it's a way to drive economic growth and profitability for businesses, and wage growth, which we've seen none of in years and years and years. And we know that it works. There's 4 million workers on enterprise agreements have higher wages that grow faster than the 2.2 million workers on awards, if you compare just two small groups in an industry. So what a lost opportunity, John.
Oh, look, it really is. The system remains, in 2021, it remains an exceedingly complex system. And in terms of compliance even, there's a need to make the system simpler so that staff, workers are more easily able to identify their rights. I know from even practice, Ellen, many people only discover later, when they've actually taken the time to go through an award or an EBA, that they may not have been paid the correct amount. For employers, overwhelmingly they want to do the right thing, but equally, I've worked with so many over the years who just struggle to work their way around the system. I advised someone rather recently on a particular staff member, and I had to give them advice that, look, 3 possible awards could apply to this particular staff member. They had no problem paying what they needed to pay, but it was knowing what they should be bound by that was exceedingly complex. So I hope that once the desire for mutual recriminations over who's responsible for the breakdown, if we can get past that, then think about it. Is there any reason why we can't reignite those discussions and that work towards fixing what we need to? If anything that's been apparent to me over the commentary over recent days is that everybody wants to move on this. And in fact, I look at this debate, whether it's Sally's position or whether it's the government's, the BCA's or ACCI's or AI Group, and I think despite the differences, there's heaps of common ground. So I would hope that the parties can revisit this. And there's no reason why they can't. Yes, we've fallen at this hurdle in many respects and only been able to secure some reforms, and very minimal at that. But there's so much more to work for, and I think we all agree.
But
it needs to be done.
Sally, if it couldn't be pulled off now, with all that goodwill that came out of COVID and every Australian working together, personal sacrifice for the collective good, that's what the story of COVID in this country is about. And that's the story of this IR attempted reform. When the heck are we going to pull it off?
Well, like I said, we did reach agreement with the BCA, which is the big business in this country, and with COSBOA, which is small business in this country. They were two historic agreements. They were not easy. That took months and months of discussion, of listening to each other, genuinely listening to each other, them being prepared to accept that we, don't want to see workers lose rights. You can have a more simpler system if you also ensure you have fairness. The problem is that the government didn't want to go forward with those agreements. Instead, unfortunately, they were listening to the more extreme elements who were just wanting it the employer's way. So, of course, there would be a way forward. And you've got to remember with enterprise bargaining, like all of those stats that are quoted are true, and it is no longer fit for purpose because we don't have the same economy we had back when Paul Keating and Bob Hawke were around. It's changed incredibly.
What killed it for you? Was it when the government said, look, for COVID-affected businesses, we're going to pull out that guarantee that any deal they do in the workplace will not leave workers worse off? Was that what killed it for you?
No. We already knew that we were in trouble, and the whole idea of consensus had been walked away from when the other employers refused to accept the agreement that we came to with the BCA.
Business
then what
Council of
happened is
Australia.
the government went... Yes, and the government then went completely quiet. Those employer groups went and lobbied the Liberal Party privately, and what we got back was the Omnibus Bill. So that was a missed opportunity, the fact that people were not brave enough to go forward in a different way, to put aside, arguments from the 1970s. Like, honestly, having to sit through, if the people of Australia had to listen to what we listened to for those 4 or 5 months of those working groups, I know where their sympathies would lie. They'd lie with us and with COSBOA and the BCA.
Was that your view, Peter, that despite the frustration in the workshops between parties who've frankly been in metaphorical trenches for years now, that there was some hope of a compromise, and then something happened behind closed doors in Parliament House between some elements of big business and the government? I mean, you've been around those corridors for years. Is that what happened?
Well, that's the only thing that can happen, because what we saw early on was a great desire, as you just said before, to get a result out of this. We were only interested in reality and getting results as well. And all of a sudden something happened.
What was it? Was it removing the guarantee? Was it, as I put to Sally, removing the guarantee that no worker would be worse off? Was that a breach of faith?
Oh, look, we could talk about that. I think the issue was the labour hire firms, and I really believe this. They were the cause of most of these problems that we're looking at, and they are very much represented by the Australian Industry Group and the Australian Chamber.
And why would it have been in their interests to sink any deal that made it easier, particularly enterprise bargaining, easier for an employer and the workers to come together and make a flexible deal that made everybody better off? Why would the labour hire firms want to sabotage that?
It destroys their business model. Their business model is built about taking advantage of the complexity.
So you think, therefore, what?
Well, I think that we should... let's talk about reality. I think, Sally, this is where we've been able to talk, is saying, hang on, this is what happens in a business. So Jennifer Westacott could talk about what happened in a big business with Sally. We could talk about what happened in small, they're quite different, and talk about how do we fix these particular problems. And let's do it bit by bit. Let's not ask for total change. That's called work choices. Let's not ask for that. Let's just see what we can get. Let's prove to each other we can trust each other, and then let's move on and see what else we can do.
Are you saying to me, though, that you think that the labour hire firms wanted to get rid of that guarantee that workers wouldn't be worse off, which is called the better off overall test that has to be met? Do you think that was what was going on behind the scenes?
Oh, look, everybody wants, on the employer side of it, and we don't get affected by that because we don't do agreements, but it is an odd test and it needs to be reviewed, and that's an area where the ACTU and COSBOA would disagree, and there's a few other areas, but that the boot test doesn't really work, and it doesn't, and I think it's been shown why it doesn't, and I'll leave that to big business and others to argue through. But the labour hire firms have been big players in this. As I say, their business model is to take advantage of the complexity, use it for their own purpose, and what they do is they don't employ people as casuals. I mean, that's what the court said. and that's caused a problem for everybody else. What they did has caused problems for small business, which was fixed. Michaelia Cash and the government did fix that last week with support from the crossbench. We shouldn't forget that they got that particular issue through. Now let's go and focus on the other ones, and let's not focus on all of them. Let's do what we're doing with the ACTU and do it bit by bit, where we can find agreement, we can look at what we need to do and move forward.
Okay, John, can I turn to you? The Australian's Paul Kelly wrote that removing that guarantee that workers wouldn't be worse off was a grave tactical blunder by the government, and he also described it as tactically inept. And in the end, the government backflipped on the whole thing to try to get the bill through. That seems extraordinary to me, if that analysis is correct. Because you'll remember that's what did John Howard in. Remember, he got rid of the no disadvantage test in work choices, and that cost him government and his political career.
Yeah, Ellen, I've long thought that you mess with the better off overall test at your peril, and it's a feature of our industrial relations architecture, like it or not. And I take on board Peter's points. I've encountered many issues around the boot which at a process level, procedurally, could be fixed to make the process easier to achieve. But in terms of the substance, the safety net that's in that better off overall test, however it's been called over the years, I think is part of the permanent architecture. And you can, with careful negotiations, with give and take, I think you can, and I hope that in the future we can at least secure some reforms that mean you can get good agreements through that allow for some flexibility. But the fundamental importance of that test, I think, is something Australians generally want. So I think I might have even said in a previous discussion, Ellen, that was going to be a problem, and as it turned out, it certainly was. And
what of Kelly's analysis? Grave tactical blunder, tactically inept. Do you think that was part of the problem?
Look, I'm not amenable to that language, but I think the essence of it's correct, that it really created problems the government didn't need, and it could have achieved a hell of a lot, perhaps, if that wasn't in there.
Madeleine, in the end, the government chose to ditch proposals to criminalise wage theft, and that's what your friends have been talking about.
Absolutely. I think the thing is that wage theft isn't an isolated problem to the COVID pandemic. Wage theft has been a rampant thing for many years already. And like I said before, when I was talking about my friends' experiences, I think it's really disappointing to see the lack of criminalisation surrounding wage theft in the omnibus bill, which was, I'm quite disappointed, I guess, yeah.
And at the Students' Association, how many, is it unusual for students to come to you and say, look, I'm not getting super, or I'm not getting what I think I should get?
I wish I could tell you it was an isolated incident, but unfortunately it's not. I get emails almost, every 3 days about someone who has been cheated out of their pay or something illegal's going on at their work, and the other organisation at ANU, the Postgraduate Students Organisation, actually did a survey about it, and they found that about 54% of international students weren't receiving pay slips, and I think it was almost... At all. And about...
What are they getting, just in the bank or...
a lot of people I've also talked to, businesses give them cash on hand after their shifts, instead of going through proper super channels and going through proper payslip channels. And there's just so much wage theft going on, not only on campus businesses, but also just generally within not only small businesses, but also big businesses. So I think the government really needs to step up and take action on this.
Sally?
Ellen, this is also the one thing that business and the unions and the government agreed on. Out of the 5 things, this one, there was consensus that there needed to be new laws. And, we got to know COSBOA so much better during the discussions. I naively and wrongly thought that they'd oppose these laws. And, Peter can talk for himself, but the thing that sticks in my mind is he said, look, we don't like it either because it's unfair competition. So when his members, all the good small employers, are paying people properly, they're competing against people who aren't. And so what does it say when after all of that, like the one thing we all agreed on that would be good for the country, that would help in terms of low wage growth, help in terms of just basic justice for people and fairness for business, gets dumped, and it got dumped by the government. So I don't think that all goes well for moving forward together.
Yeah. Well, the government now says it wouldn't be fair to impose new compliance regime on employers without reducing the complexity of awards. So they say it all goes together. We are short on time. Let me go to you, Peter Strong. Jennifer Westacott from the Business Council of Australia says the consequence of this, I guess, stuff up would be a fair way to describe it, is that we've condemned Australians to decades of low wages. Is that the result?
Well, it won't be the result if we keep working together, and that's what we're doing with the ACTU. And I think you might remember a few years ago we signed an MOU with the Business Council of Australia, which raised a few eyebrows. Where we can work together, we want to work together to get the right result.
But this was an opportunity to do it across the economy. This was an opportunity to do it for everybody. And I want you to be straight with me, because you were in the room and Sally was in the room, and it seems like everybody's blaming everybody else for why this fell apart. And you know, this is a lost moment for Australia. So be really frank about it. Will this affect wages growth for the people watching tonight?
Well, it will affect it, but we still have the opportunity to do more. This is not lost forever. This is something, an event happened, we got something out of it, which was the casuals decision. It is not a lost forever. We can keep working on this, and we've got to keep discussing this, and we've got to develop the trust so we can do that. And at the moment, there's trust between us and the ACTU, but I don't trust the other industry associations. I don't think Sally does. I'm not talking for her, but I bet she doesn't.
Sally, I saw a photo that you tweeted on the weekend, 27 years since you were a young union official. I think we've got it somewhere, and there you are. There's a whole bunch of people. We could go through it, and you're dressed in purple. We can see Bill Kelty. Everybody else is young, and here he is. Bill's looked the same age for years and years. And he was there. He ushered in enterprise bargaining with Paul Keating and Bob Hawke all those years ago to really supercharge Australia's economy, drive wages, productivity and economic growth. And it feels like that you were present almost at what may be the dying moments of this, and we've been condemned to a 20th century industrial relations model. That's a pretty horrible legacy for the Secretary of the ACTU to say, well, I was there at the beginning as a youngster and I was there at the end when we couldn't save it.
Well, you assume history ends today, Ellen, which I don't. The issue of record low wage growth and, you know, will the current enterprise bargaining system, if we fiddled with it, which was all that was being proposed in the working groups, we're not going to fix record low wage growth that way. It's an issue of bargaining power, and working people in our country no longer have enough of it in order to push wages up. That's a much deeper problem than just fiddling with things, and we're up for that deeper problem. We're up for sitting down and working out solutions to it. But you know, do I think it's going to happen, you know, next year or the year after? Probably not. Like when you say, you know, is that wasted? I don't think it's wasted in terms of the relationships that have been built directly with business and directly with the union movement. I think that that's enduring, I hope, in terms of moving a way forward. But we probably don't have any trust that this government will take something forward that isn't going to actually hurt workers. So that's a bit of a red line for us.
Yeah. The AFR calls it a way to waste a crisis, and we just figured out what happened, I guess. That's all we have time for. Thanks so much, Madeleine, for coming in. Lovely to see you. To Peter Strong, Sally McManus and John Pesutto. Good to see you again, John. Have a great evening, and Julia will be back with you tomorrow night. Good night to you.